All right, we've got the 2-minute grace period. Okay. Hi again, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Emily Tracy. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Code for America, and so thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar. This is our first installment of Code for America's Find Your Summit series, which we are co-sponsoring and co-hosting with the JPMorgan Chase PolicyCenter. We're so much looking forward to the discussion on the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, two of the most effective economic security programs available to individuals and families. I will turn it over to our moderator in just a moment, but first, just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders. The first is that we ask all attendees to please be on mute, but we encourage you to use the chat function if you want to communicate with each other. Please also submit questions for our panelists by clicking the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will answer as many questions as we can during the time that we've held for Q&A. Second, for those of you on social media, we would love for you to participate by tagging hashtag CFA Summit and hashtag JPMC PolicyCenter. Third, as a reminder, please keep Code for America's Code of Conduct in mind so that we can be sure to maintain a respectful environment for all. For awareness, Glennis is popping in the Code of Conduct link in the chat. And then finally, Code for America would like to thank JPMorgan Chase for their partnership and support of our efforts to streamline the tax filing process for low-income families through our tools, Get Your Refund and Get CTC. All right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Wheat, president of the JPMC Institute, who will introduce our panelists. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for that really wonderful introduction. And thank you, Code for America, for being such a wonderful partner on this event. And on behalf of JPMorgan Chase, I want to thank our audience and panelists for joining us today. As Emily noted, I lead the JPMorgan Chase Institute. We are an economic policy research team, and we seek to answer policy relevant questions across a number of themes, including but not limited to labor policy, housing, economic development, and higher education. One of the things that we've looked at fairly consistently over the years has been a question about how households manage their money, especially during times of economic instability. The JPMorgan Chase Institute previously released a report that used the bank's de-identified administrative data to show how families use the advanced child tax credit payments. In addition to helping people understand the different things that families are spending on, we really lean into trying to help people understand how the spending response differed for different income and demographic groups, which we'll discuss a little bit more during this program. As the cost of living continues to increase among Americans and experts see signs of maybe a slowdown forthcoming, we really want to think about how financially vulnerable families are possibly going to face heightened challenges to achieving the kind of financial security and long-term economic mobility we would seek to offer for those families. Public benefits, economic security, and economic security net programs like the CTC and the EITC are an important foundation of financial stability and resilience that both cushion the impact of economic shocks and also act as a springboard for longer-term wealth building. In fact, earlier this week, JPMorgan's CEO, Jamie Dimon, called for an expansion to the EITC in the annual report letter that came out earlier this week. And not only did he draw attention to the importance of closing the refundable credit gap, but he also emphasized how important it is to consider expanding the EITC for childless workers and thinking about shifting toward a monthly cadence for those credits. In light of the fiscal supports that appeared during the pandemic but are starting to run their course, and more broadly, a public benefit system that's complex and who's eligible, how to apply, and how it gets delivered, we're really at an opportune moment to reflect on the kinds of reforms that might address the barriers and build momentum for an evidence-based set of improvements to both of these programs. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to introduce this panel of experts that we have joining us today. As each of you hear your name and bio read, I encourage and welcome you to unmute and join me on screen. So let's start with David Newville. David is the Senior Program Director of the Tax Benefits Program at Code for America. David spent the last decade in Washington building financial security for low and moderate income people. In every role he has held, he has created and advocated for policies and programs informed by robust data, rigorous analysis, and the lived experiences of those on the margins of the US economy. David served as Vice President of Policy and Research at Prosperity Now, a national organization dedicated to building stability, wealth, and prosperity in the United States. David was also a senior policy advisor in the US Department of the Treasury during the Obama administration and with the Financial Health Network, where he focused on consumer protection, financial access, and non-bank financial regulation. Next is Megan Kern. Megan is the Director of Policy at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. Her research explores policy strategies for child poverty reduction with an emphasis on income supports, poverty targets, and cross-national learning, including how the structure and impact of child allowance programs in other nations might inform the creation of similar US-based programs. Her recent work on how COVID-19 economic relief efforts impact the children and families also examines the way in which a regularly delivered child allowance can support children through the immediate crisis and beyond. Curran has worked as a legislative analyst in the United States House of Representatives and the Scottish Parliament, and as a researcher on child and family poverty. Welcome, Megan. Finally, we have Ted McCann, Vice President for Programs and Policies at the American Idea Foundation. Ted has served in the highest levels of government, along with corporations and nonprofits. During his tenure in Congress, he served as a senior advisor to the Speaker of the House, staff director of the House Ways and Means Social Security Subcommittee, and as an analyst with the House Budget Committee. He negotiated and drove the passage of dozens of pieces of legislation, including passage of the Evidence Act, criminal justice reform, and the largest improvement to Social Security's finances since 1983. As Vice President of Programs and Policies of the American Idea Foundation, Ted works along former Speaker Paul Ryan at the American Idea Foundation, engaging third-party organizations in order to ensure that evidence is fully utilized in the federal policymaking process. So thank you to all of our panelists, and let's jump in with the question. So this is really a question for all three panelists. Across both Wall Street and Capitol Hill, there are growing concerns of the economy softening as interest rates continue to see increases. This pressure, coupled with the additional stressors like a rising national cost of living, make it challenging, but all the more crucial for lower income families to build a foundation of financial resilience. As we consider preparations for the next slowdown, whether it may be, whenever that might actually happen, what do you think are the best strategies for building financial security and improving economic mobility for families? And David, let's start with you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thanks to you and JPMC for your partnership on today's webinar. Very excited for this and kicking off the pre-summit activities. Your question is an excellent one. I think from the pandemic and the response that happened there with regards to kind of low-income families and their financial stability, I think we learned a ton from the pandemic and kind of the response there. Some lessons we can build on, some lessons we can improve on. But I think one of the areas that's most interesting from the perspective of Code for America is really thinking about how we can ease the administrative burdens around kind of accessing, obviously, tax benefits, but many other important benefits out there as well. As you know, Code for America also works closely on its SNAP programs and WIC, and looking at pandemic EBT and other types of programs like that. I think there's a lot of strides that have been made to ease access and to simplify it to reach folks. The work we did with the Advanced Child Tax Credit to reach folks and using the IRS regulations around simplified filing to ease that. I think if we do unfortunately find ourselves in a situation where the economy begins to slow and we look at the data and see some severe impacts on low income families, and want, if there's policy decisions made to bring in new types of tax benefits or to expand them or bring in temporary measures, I think we've seen the success of when the money gets to the right people and the impact it can have on them, and really kind of easing those burdens that people might experience and economic downturns, and building on the learnings around the administration of these programs. In addition, trying to make connections between them too, making it easier for people to very easily, who are eligible for both tax benefits and also potentially for different types of safety net benefits, trying to make that as seamless as possible, which is not easy given the challenges, obviously, especially when it's federally administrative programs like tax benefits that come from the IRS versus programs that are administered at the state level like SNAP benefits. But we've seen a lot of cooperation at the state level too, between, state revenue agencies and state human service agencies that can begin to ease the connections there and make it easier for people to access these benefits. And when people do receive them, whether they're excluded, thinking about people in the gap, when people receive these benefits, it's also, it's clearly very beneficial. But beyond that, there are millions more families who do receive them, but have a high administrative burden accessing them during already difficult economic times where they might be losing their jobs or struggling in other ways. I think whatever we can do to ease that burden and get people the benefits more quickly, more easily, obviously frees up their bandwidth to meet their own individual family needs and take care of their family needs during what could be a difficult time, but hopefully won't be.
Great, makes a ton of sense. Megan, same question. Strategies that could really help build financial security and improve that economic mobility?
Sure. Thanks so much. And I apologize in advance if at any point during this webinar you hear sirens behind me. It might go on and off from mute. I'm based in New York City, and that's just what happens. Yeah, two things come to mind. I think, these would have been things that many people have thought about for a long time, but I think the experience of the pandemic really crystallized it. The first is, how important and how really useful just having access to flexible cash is, and having that also, in terms of, especially if it's assistance directed towards families with low and moderate incomes, that's also available on a regular basis. So, Chris, in your opening remarks, you had mentioned, monthly payments and things like that. And, we can talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the recent child tax credit expansion. Families are able to use sort of regular unrestricted cash in sort of much more useful ways, to incorporate it in their household budgets, address whatever their particular family needs are, and those might change over the course of the year, of course, from one month to the next. So I think, flexible cash is really key. And then also making this cash and other types of supports, whether it's food assistance, housing assistance, job assistance, as David was saying a bit, available and accessible without overly onerous sort of conditions attached. So, all too often we condition a lot of our access to really key basic need supports, health, housing, food, on, the type of work that someone's in, or their age, or their family type, or, very narrow income bands, or their immigration status, the list goes on. And, I think if you're talking about, a very uncertain or a changing economy, these, tying access to these really, basic need supports on these types of things, but especially employment related conditions that, sometimes families actually just don't have control over, whether or not they're going to get enough hours at work or how much money they're going to make, are not just not helpful, but also can be quite detrimental. And I think we saw that in the pandemic, and we made changes in the pandemic accordingly that were really helpful. And especially when you're talking about kids, a lot of my research focuses on children, conditioning access to really basic needs on, family circumstances that they don't have control over, whether or not, their parents have a certain type of job or are able to work, things like that. That's, for kids, and what we know about, what impacts their well-being, making these types of supports more available rather than less is really key. And I think with the experience of the child tax credit that we saw while the expansion was in place, we removed a lot of those barriers for the first time, and that was a huge reason why, it had the success that it did.
Great, thank you, Megan. Ted, any thoughts on ways to really improve or build financial security, improve economic mobility? I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, I do think folks mentioned a number of good ideas. I mean, I think as we think about the EITC, there's been a lot of conversation around expanding it both on the lower end, sort of the age spectrum, and the higher end of the age spectrum. I think both those sort of seem to make a decent amount of sense. As we think about sort of mobility a bit more, I think one of the things that would be really useful to do, and I think the Congress has made some progress in some of this, but really trying to identify ways that we can sort of get folks more integrated into the banking sector more broadly, right? Folks that don't have the ability to have, savings accounts or things of that nature, ways that they can sort of build up small buffers so that things like car problems or transportation issues don't cause individuals to lose jobs and things of that nature. And I think folks are working hard at trying to sort of make some of those issues happen. I mean, in the policy space, we saw the passage of the Secure 2.0 bill recently that would allow for the ability for people to withdraw for greater hardships from their 401ks and things of that nature. And so I think really developing the institutions and ability for people to develop sort of a savings and ability to sort of withstand some of the sort of difficulties in life with a bit more less fragility in their personal finances would be extremely helpful, and something that we can do, that public policy can sort of help with.
Got it. Thanks, Tim. So Megan, one theme across both the work that you've been doing at Columbia and these tax credits as a kind of family of solutions really is a larger effort and a focus on reducing child poverty in particular as a way of thinking about boosting economic security. I hosted a panel a while ago around the time that we released the paper I mentioned before. And Betsy Stevenson was on that panel. Betsy Stevenson, former White House CA member, former chief economist, Department of Labor. She said something to the effect of, I wish policymakers acted as children were their main constituents. Funding allocation on the federal level probably changed for the better. Can you help folks in the audience understand how exposure to financial insecurity affects the long-term outcomes and differences that we see across racial and ethnic groups as it relates to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think Betsy Stevenson is right here in that, children, if you look at kind of budget trends over time, like children have just not really been as much of a priority as they could be in our public spending decisions. There are great sources of information like the Kids Share report that's put out every year by the Urban Institute that tracks, like how children fare in public expenditures. There's, and you can see that, the trends are that, kids have a very small slice of the pie, even just compared to other population groups. But also, their most recent report actually showed that, during the pandemic, the per child spending, on the federal level actually shot up to a historic high. And, we saw that at the same time, other indicators, in terms of how kids were faring, also changed over that same period. So we saw child poverty in 2021, the most recent annual information that's available to date, it was actually a historic low. So, I mean, those two things are connected, right? We're spending more on kids, and then child poverty goes down. And one of the biggest things that the reports by the Census Bureau, put out, but of course, my colleagues and I at Columbia have done a lot of work on it, and many researchers across the country looking at the impact of the expansions to the tax credits over the same period, and specifically the child tax credit. A lot more money went into that program. A lot more money went into the hands, into the bank accounts of families across the country. And there's, you can draw a direct line between these two things. But reducing child poverty is, of course, not just hugely important for how children fare in both the short term and the long term, because of the impact that we know it has on child development, and of course, how well kids are going to fare when they turn become adults. But it's also, reducing child poverty matters a lot for just the health of our sort of society and country and economy as a whole. The National Academy of Sciences had put out this really sort of landmark report on child poverty right before COVID hit. And, it was referencing research that shows that child poverty costs an incredible amount to us as, each year in terms of dollars. So anywhere between $800 billion and $1.1 trillion per year is, basically the cost of the economic cost of child poverty. So when you see in 2021 that we're actually able to reduce child poverty to the lowest it's been on record, that is a win for kids, and it's also a win for the sort of health of our country. And so, we know basically too that, we can close, cutting something like child poverty in half reduces that sort of immediate economic drain that's going, but it also means that for all of the kids that we see, disparities in terms of, we know that children of color are hit a lot harder by child poverty, both in the exposure and what it means for long-term impacts. We know now from research, again, some of my colleagues at Columbia have seen that reducing child poverty when kids are at the lowest point of ages in their childhood actually then reduces their risk of being in poverty in adolescence and young adulthood, and then so on and so forth. And basically it's taking these steps now when kids are young, and by actually doing that through spending decisions at the federal level, can have huge long-term positive consequences.
That makes a bunch of sense. Megan, you just spoke to some of the research and how it speaks to some of these questions. Ted, I know you spent a lot of time advocating for educating people about how to use evidence in making actual policy decisions. I was wondering if you could speak to your read on how the evidence around CTC and EITC are related to policymaking around economic security for families.
So I think the evidence is really strong that the CTC and EITC are probably our largest contributors to sort of reductions in child poverty. I think one of the pieces of one of the papers that was most influential to me as I was sort of developing my view on this was Jim Sullivan wrote a paper called "Winning the War on Poverty," I think in 2012. This is a long time ago now. But basically, it went through a lot of the different sort of programs that we provide for low-income individuals to reduce poverty. And the largest contributor to reductions in poverty have been basically to the tax code. And that includes sort of the reduction in taxes for income taxes for low-income folks as we took folks off the rolls, but also really significantly the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. The EITC especially is able to provide these benefits without reducing sort of work incentives. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why it has such broad support throughout the Congress, is because it does. I think you can make the argument pretty strongly that it reduces poverty. It also sort of improves work incentives for folks and sort of continues to keep them into the workforce or draw them into the workforce. The child tax credit also has pretty strong support. I think broadly, I think we've seen new proposals from Senator Romney and other folks around this issue. There's obviously a difference of opinion between Republicans and Democrats as they think about how they want to structure the child tax credit. But I think they do, both sides are now sort of gravitating, especially on the Republican side, are much more gravitating towards ways they can support families. And I think they do view the child tax credit as one of the key ways that you can reduce child poverty and support families. So I think the evidence is pretty strong, especially around the EITC, that evidence is strong for both, that they reduce poverty. For the earned income tax credit, it's extraordinarily strong. It both reduces poverty and improves work incentives. So,
David, so Code for America has been really innovative in thinking about how to help families get access to benefits through the existing economic security net. One of the issues that you've been trying to address has been looking at the existing refundable tax credit coverage gap. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Help us understand what the size and dimensions are of that gap, and even walk through some recommendations on how we might approach tackling that problem as you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Code for America, over the course of the last 4 years, we've learned a ton about, reaching out to what we like to refer to as new filers, also known as non-filers, folks who are not required to file a return, but, have tax benefits that they're eligible for. And it's been interesting to kind of see the progress that we've been able to make and the learnings we've been able to discover through the process of experimenting, doing different types of outreach with both our products. The first product being Get Your Refund, which is focused on offering a virtual component to VITA sites to reach folks who are eligible to use VITA tax filing services, roughly folks who make less than $57,000 a year. And then also our e-filing service, which we did in support of the Advanced Child Tax Credit, get CTC, which offered kind of a simplified filing process authorized by the IRS. And what we discovered is, there's unfortunately not a ton of data out there on a lot of the details of the exact nature of folks who fall in the gap. We do know with the EITC that roughly 1 out of 5, folks who are eligible miss out on it. That it's around 5 to 7 million households that are missing out on the EITC, which is not small. We've also looking collectively at tax benefits for the current tax year, for the 2022 tax year, we estimate when you look at all federal benefits, EITC, CTC, and state benefits as well, we've come up with an estimate that there's a gap of around $15 billion in terms of dollar numbers that folks are missing out on. During the pandemic, obviously, when tax benefits were even more generous, we estimated that gap was even higher, around 40 billion based on our numbers. So it's a sizable amount of money that's out there that folks are missing out on. One of the tough things is, the IRS does do kind of an annual top lines estimate of, folks who are missing out on the EITC with some data there. And they did release, information about, stimulus payments gaps, Advanced Child Tax Credit gaps during the pandemic as well. We don't really have a good sense of the data out there about the nature of the gap and more details to dig beneath that. One of our recommendations, really the starting point for beginning to close the gap is having better data in a lot of sense. And I think, the IRS, during the pandemic is very reasonable. They struggled being under-resourced and overworked in many ways and did an amazing job. But I think one of the things we're excited about now, kind of coming out of the pandemic and with the IRS having, more regular funding and investments, obviously the Inflation Reduction Act helps a lot, is that we might be able to dig into this data a little bit more in order to better target outreach and understand how to close that gap. One of our recommendations has been that their IRS release kind of an annual, state of the tax gap type report, which can include more information than just kind of estimates on the numbers, but really kind of dig into demographic data of who's in the gap, potentially if there is geographic data about hotspots where, new filers / non-filers might be. Also trying to better understand, are these folks who just don't file, or did they attempt to file and it didn't get, kind of digging deeper into the to the nature of what the engagement with these folks have been in the tax filing system, and looking more broadly at data too to get better estimates, because there are many different sources that are used, whether it's census data, there's SSA data. Obviously the IRS also has pretty robust information return data when it comes to W-2s and 1099s from folks who may have never filed. So really beginning to kind of pull all those pieces together and to zero in on, here's the CTC gap, at least as they exist now, EITC versus other tax benefits, I think would be enormously helpful. And then beyond, having better data, I think one thing that the IRS has done a good job on that we'd love to see them do even more that can really reduce that gap is outreach. The IRS during the pandemic sent several rounds of letters out to folks who might have been missing stimulus payments, EITC, Advanced Child Tax Credit. We don't have formal analysis of the effectiveness of it. That would be another thing that would be great to include in the annual, the taxpayer, the tax benefits gap, is a better understanding of like how many people respond and the demographics of folks who respond to those letters. But our informal estimates are that, those letters do pretty well. They're coming from the IRS, they're targeted at people who are very likely to have missed out on tax benefits. And many of those people went to our tool, the IRS tool, and other tools to file when those letters went out. And kind of just as simple as sending those out can have a huge impact on kind of driving people to sources to file. In the future, it'd be even great to move beyond letters into text messaging and other electronic means and doing several rounds. Obviously, it's a lot cheaper to send text messages than paper letters too, so it's more efficient in many ways. So thinking about more robust outreach mechanisms is really important. And then the third thing I think that would really be fantastic for reducing the gap is simplifying the tax filing process. We had a great natural experiment during the pandemic with the simplified filing procedures, the revenue procedure that the IRS released. Obviously, it was focused on very low income people because we had tax benefits where you could have no income, when it came to stimulus payments and the Advanced Child Tax Credit, that if you qualified, you could receive them. So folks could literally put a 1 or a 0 on their tax return and skip over most of the 1040 and file a return, which is basically the regulation that we leverage to run our Get CTC tool. it really taught us a lot about, when you do simplify the process, the results of people filing is enormously higher. And these are folks, again, who are, were in the gap, may currently be back in the gap when it comes to tax benefits if they're not eligible for other benefits. And, we learned a ton about, if you don't ask people for tax documents and you simplify that process, it really incredibly drives traffic and filing behavior by folks and makes it much easier for them. I think having tax documents, imputing tax documents correctly, is a huge barrier for folks to get through the tax filing process, among some others. And when you make it much shorter and you remove that document barrier, we found that people are much more likely to file. And we hope the IRS could leverage this in other ways in the future in order to really drive and close the gap with that combination of data, simple process, and obviously a robust outreach.
Yeah, that makes a bunch of sense. It's especially salient at this time of year when a lot of folks are kind of engaging with some of the complexities of the tax filing system. Really sort of puts a light on sort of what that might mean for many of these families that might not be interacting in that way, and sort of how much it can make a difference to really simplify that. So as I mentioned before, we had done some research looking at the advanced CTC payments. There's a bit of an overlap, I think, between that research and some of what you're talking about, David, to the extent that you imagine that some of those non-filers might be lower income families. We saw a really marked responsivity to those payments amongst the lowest income families in our data, right? Where they were the ones who were most likely to spend, particularly on non-durable, out of the payments that they got, the advanced payments that they got. Megan, I was wondering if you could help us dig in a little bit to the CTC as one of the two tax credits we're focusing in on. Give us maybe a bit of a current state of play on that credit and the main ways that it and other support programs are really helping improve outcomes for financially vulnerable families.
Yeah, so I mean, just to set the stage a little bit, prior to the pandemic, prior to the 2021 expansion, the child tax credit was something that was identified by many folks who had been looking at it for years as something that was ripe for a bit of reform. It's the largest federal expenditure on kids, but historically it has really not reached a really sizable proportion of children in general, but also especially those who really could benefit from it the most. So, and this is due to kind of the combination of the earnings requirement formula and the way the benefit phases in. With your income levels, and also the some limits on how much families who had low tax liability could get back as a refund. All of these things kind of combining together essentially saw about 1 out of every 3 children in the U.S. nationwide being left out of the full child tax credit prior to the pandemic years. But this exclusion didn't, and that's basically because their parents didn't earn enough to qualify for the full benefit under this formula. But, this sort of exclusion didn't hit kids equally. It was disproportionately Black and Latino children who were left out. It was disproportionately younger children, children in single parent families, children in rural areas, children in larger families. It was kind of like, you could cut it so many different ways, and you could see a lot of sort of inequalities here. And the form, and the way that the child tax credit was structured, it also kind of kept moving the goalposts on families as well, in terms of, if you added another child to your family, you actually needed to earn more to be able to retain access to the full credit, which, as we know, is sort of really backwards in terms of how you don't necessarily all of a sudden start earning more money when you have more kids. So all of this was combining to actually, leave a lot of kids out of this really important benefit. And so some of the key changes that we saw in 2021 actually addressed this gap, very clearly. So we saw 3 key changes made under the American Rescue Plan expansion. The first was the total benefit amounts were increased. And we also saw an extra bump for young kids under the age of 6. We saw that all of those kids who used to be excluded because of their parents' level of earnings were actually included, because we removed these, earnings requirements and changed the refundability thing. And then, of course, one of the most distinctive features was actually transforming half of the payment just because of timing in the year when it was introduced, half of it into monthly installments rather than having for a family to wait, until tax time to receive the whole thing. So all of these things together, in combination produced, really significant results. Yeah, like I said earlier, there's a lot of research out there. I have tried and probably not been able to ever include everything, but we do have some, sort of what we call research roundups on the child tax credit available on our Columbia site. Some of the JPMorgan Chase research has featured into it. Some of the Code for America work has featured in it as well. And, basically we saw that now all of a sudden the credit was reaching almost all kids in the US. In terms of their eligibility. There still were, of course, some access challenges that David has, talked about in terms of the tax filing system, but it closed a lot of gaps in terms of who had been historically left out. It increased, what families had access to in their bank accounts on a day-to-day basis, as the JPMorgan Chase reports showed very clearly. It helped to reduce poverty to the lowest that we had on record. It, reduced food insecurity, reduced financial stress. There's early indications that it was good for kids' health. We've also seen, reduced ER visits and child maltreatment reports. Again, probably, linked to reduced stress in the home. And, a wealth of evidence showed that families spent it first and foremost on, either kids items, so like kids clothing, things like that, or just basic household needs. So one of the basically most common ways that families were spending it was on food. And this actually went up a decent way through the income distribution too, that was reported as one of the most common items. It wasn't just, families with the lowest or most moderate levels of income. And we also saw that, all the while it didn't, disrupt parental work or employment trends or things like that. So all of this was like really important wealth of evidence that was produced and kind of indicates a really successful sort of policy experiment, given the fact that it was temporary. But in terms of, the state of play where we are now, the expansion, of course, as everyone knows, did not continue past 2021. And so we are actually in a situation where a lot of those exclusions, actually all of those exclusions that I mentioned at the start in terms of kids who are left out, is now back in play. So, I think there were some updated estimates from the Tax Policy Center that, just under 30% of kids, are likely to be left out of the child tax credit again, just once you update sort of income data for the country. But I think, as Ted pointed out, the conversation at the federal level very much continues, so there is still a lot of momentum and interest in figuring out, how can we actually think about an improved federal credit moving forward. And I think there's a lot of actually really interesting work emerging at the state level. So, the 2021 version didn't continue right now, but I think this is very much an area that's still live and an area to watch and something we'll see progress on at some point again.
Thanks, Megan. David, I was wondering if you could do something like really quick on just kind of giving a high level on sort of state of play on EITC.
Yeah, absolutely. EITC, is the largest anti-poverty program in the country. It's been around for decades. It has an enormous, as Ted mentioned, has an enormous impact on poverty. The program itself, in contrast to the advanced child tax credit, to be eligible for it, you have to have earned income, and it usually phases out around $50,000 for families with children, roughly $15,000 to $20,000 for those who are single or non-custodial parents. It's been a huge driver, the biggest refundable credit, as I mentioned, and has had a huge impact, variety of benefits for families and for children. It is, of course, much bigger for families with children. For those who do not have children or they're non-custodial parents, there was a temporary expansion of the EITC during the pandemic that roughly tripled the maximum amount that folks who did not have, who were in that role and for the first time, and made it much more substantial. That, of course, is gone now, so it's back to kind of its regular levels. But overall, we've seen huge impacts from the EITC, and we've seen a variety of states as well really take steps to kind of expand their own state level EITCs. The one issue that really exists around the EITC, especially comes back to tax administration is its complexity, and it has a very high overpayment rate, which has been a problem for the program. And obviously, there's not really good matching up or coordination between the EITC eligibility and CTC eligibility, especially for families with children, where it would make much more sense to coordinate those two. And I think that complexity in the EITC has been one of the biggest thorns in the side of the program. And I think trying to resolve that through improving tax administration, either through policy changes or the way that we do tax preparation in some ways could really ease that, both increase access to it, but also kind of ease that burden. Because unfortunately, that complexity has also led to really high audit rates of some folks who receive the EITC too, which has been a detriment despite its benefits. So overall, there's a big hope that improvements in tax administration could really deal with the overpayment issue, or at least make it better, and also make accessibility much better for those receiving it and those who are currently missing out on it.
Thanks, David. Ted, a lot of people think about states as one of the places where we get novel ideas about tax policy. Sometimes we've seen that flow go in both directions across these programs, both from states to federal and from federal to states. I was wondering how you think about how evidence is kind of helping to push those ideas in both directions, both kind of bottom up, but also top down from the federal to states, or from states to federal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more influential way is state to federal, right? So I think folks look at Congress and they look at sort of the federal government and think, oh, they're just sort of doing things without looking at the evidence, and they don't really know what works or what doesn't work. But they spend a lot of time trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And the best way to do that is to look at what's been done before. So, I mean, from my experience, so a couple of the issues I worked on when I was in the Congress were child welfare issues and then criminal justice issues. And both those issues, we passed fairly large federal reforms, in large part entirely because of what states have been doing. So child welfare, we provided a bunch of waivers to states in order to work on prevention, to allow, the kids to remain unified with their families, and to sort of help families with sort of substance abuse issues or other issues like that. But if we get in there and prevent some of the issues that were causing child abuse or neglect, we could prevent the families from being pulled apart in the first place. And that fed very, very directly into the reforms that we did around in the title, what's called Title 4E, which is sort of the main federal funding stream for child welfare programs. Similarly, criminal justice reform, we looked a lot at what the states were doing at the state level. Texas, I think, started really doing a lot of this in 2006, but there's a number of states that are experimenting in ways that you could both reduce incarceration. I mean, this is both from sort of a state issue as a big budget issue, and so things like that matter a lot, but they could reduce incarceration while also protecting public safety. And I think we took a lot of lessons learned there, and in 2018 moved a fairly large criminal justice reform bill. Similarly, you see this state EITCs. I think New York City had a fairly large experiment around their EITC. And so I think you see this, especially with the EITC, and you see it feeding into a lot of the conversations that policymakers are having right now on whether or not you should expand the program or not. As it flows down to the state level, I think, frankly, it is much more, our state colleagues always have a lot more complaints that we try to force things on them. I think that's probably the way it generally flows down. We figure out a good idea from one state, and then we tell all the other states, oh yeah, you guys should do that. So I don't have as good of information on that. I will say this, one of the things that has been very, very helpful recently is states have started to create compacts around sharing data, which a lot of that is being driven by the federal government and the data that they already have to collect. And so they're starting to share that data around job training things and things like that, to try to improve outcomes there. So that's sort of.
That makes sense. So I have one last kind of prepared question for the panelists. I want to remind folks in the audience that we do have the Q&A feature open. There's currently one question there to be directed at the panelists after this question. If you have other questions, this is a great time to get those in as we are getting close to the end of our allotted time. So my one question for each of the panelists, going back before we get to that, I think as we start thinking about the policy creation process, formation process anyway, we may be coming up on a moment in 2025 where there may be activity around tax policy with the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I was wondering if each of you had one key learning either about CTC or EITC from the pandemic that you think would be really important to crystallize ahead of that negotiation. If you could kind of get this idea into folks' heads, 2 years out, what that might be. And I will go back to Ted, perhaps to take first.
So what I would say is that I think the pandemic was a unique enough situation that's really hard to generalize the outcomes from that to 2025. And I do think that policymakers, especially on the conservative side of the aisle, Republican side of the aisle, are probably not going to be looking towards the pandemic as sort of how they're going to make a decision on CTC and EITC policy. So if you're going to sort of crystallize something, I would say like supporting families has become a much more important goal for Republican policymakers. But some of the learning specific from the pandemic, I think folks are going to view as specific to the pandemic. So
thanks. Megan, any one kind of idea you might try to crystallize out of the last few years?
Yeah, I think I'll focus specifically on the child tax credit just because that's what a lot of our research has been recently. And I think probably the biggest thing is actually to say, if you're looking at the tax policy, changes that could come down in a couple of years, is actually include the kids that have historically been left out of it. Delivering the payments monthly and those things are also really key. But I think if you had to pick one place to start is actually making sure that, kids are actually eligible for this credit. It's called the child tax credit, and we're currently leaving out about a third of the entire child population. So, that requires obviously just changing some of those formula things, but actually just including them. And that's also where you actually get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of, sort of the return on the investment there, because, states are doing some potential. There's a lot of interest in state CTCs at the moment, but actually you can see that, if you have a robust federal credit, that, states where, there's lower cost of living, but even have high poverty, states actually don't have to then top it up by much, because you'll actually see a huge impact just from a more inclusive federal credit, because those would also be the states where kids have been historically left out at greater numbers. But I think, it shows the interest across the states actually shows that, some of the really strong evidence that we saw from the federal experiment, can inspire, a whole range, red states, blue states, purple states, whatever, like a lot of these proposals are popping up, but a lot of them are also actually making sure that kids are actually included at the bottom of the income distribution as well.
Thank you. David, round us out with one thing you would want to crystallize that may or may not have been relevant to include Ted's framing from the last couple of years.
I think, in order of priority, if I had to choose, I think Megan took mine about making, child tax credit and EITC more inclusive to lower income families who might not be eligible. But I think, beyond that, I think one lesson that we definitely learned is, about simplifying the tax process. Outside of 2025, I think there are things the IRS can do now in terms of, simplifying the filing process and potentially exploring routes around, pre-population of tax data, automated data, certain populations. There's, several researchers from the Treasury and one from one of the Federal Reserve banks released a really interesting paper kind of exploring the potential of that. And I think that's something that could be deployed out 2025. But in terms of the legislative side, I think one thing that, learning from about the simplification and trying to reduce errors and increase access, as I mentioned earlier, I think, the EITC and the CTC are not really harmonized. They're very complex. There can be debates about which provisions you could, and steps you could take to simplify that and so forth, and to harmonize those in ways that make it easier for both tax administration at the IRS level and for families who are trying to access them. But I think we have learned from the pandemic, like if you make the process simpler, you will not only increase access, but you can also do it in a way that reduces errors, which is good to reduce overpayments, good to reduce audits. both for families who are on the receiving end, but also for the IRS themselves in terms of resources that are expended, and just it's not fun for anyone to be audited, and the IRS would definitely like to do less audits if not necessary, I'm sure. So I think these can be relatively cost neutral things too that can be done to improve the credits and tax policy themselves, that I think would be welcome on by many people, and makes the lives easier of many Americans and the IRS as well. So
thanks. Thank you all for your answers and for the conversation. So there are now a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I unfortunately, I'm never going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to try to do a quick version of the first one and maybe try to pull two together if there's possibly time allowing to do that. So the first one, in short, and I think this is probably a question for you, David, was about how successful the virtual e-file options had been. And there's some context there about how difficult it is for people to come in person to offices to be seen and kind of access some of these programs, but for some of these more virtual options.
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously when the pandemic happened, everyone was kind of in the VITA space when you couldn't do in-person services. Everyone later in 2020 and 2021 were kind of forced to use our platform as the virtual option. So, and we were able to reach a large number of people and support the field. So in that sense, I think it was a big success. I also think it's really interesting now this year in 2022, when a lot of VITA sites have opened up in person, there's still a really strong demand for virtual services, which I think is really kind of a testament to the success when we have, in-person VITA opening up. And it's not only on behalf of clients. I think some clients have really loved the access and the ability to do it remotely, obviously, and virtually, but also volunteers as well. I think we've been able to pull in new sources of volunteers who may not be able to or might prefer to do it remotely as well. So in that sense, I definitely would call it a success. And I think virtual services are here to stay. Although I think there's a lot of improvements to the process that we can do to streamline it and make it easier for VITA programs and clients. And that's part of what we're working on now with the IRS and VITA partners.
I now feel like I'm picking which of my children is a favorite child. They both are, in case they're listening. They're 2 and 8, so probably not. There was one last question I'll try again about Ted mentioning the states are doing some data sharing, and asked to expand a little bit on what kind of data sharing states are doing into what.
Yeah, different states are doing different things, right? So there's a program called, NYU had a spinoff, New York University had a spinoff group called Coleridge Initiative that was working with, I think, 5 or 6 different states. They're getting access to a bunch of different data. I think the big ones, I think they have maybe new directory and new hire data, some quarterly wage. They had a significant amount of data. And so once you get this data, you can sort of track, how effective your programs are a little bit more. In the Midwest, they're doing the various Department of Labor. Various departments of labor are sort of trying to share data, and I think they're trying to identify, okay, are their job training programs working, things of that nature. And so I think, especially when you look at the job training is a good example of this, when you're looking at how effective they are, it's very useful to have sort of regional data, because people, if you live in Chicago, you might move to Wisconsin, right? And if you can't sort of track that across state as easily, it's more difficult. So things like that is what folks are starting to do.
Apologies to the other askers of questions. They were all good questions. We were just running out of time. So again, thank you to the audience. Thank you to the panelists. And I'm going to hand it back over to Emily.
Thank you, Chris. That was an awesome discussion. I really appreciate you, Chris, for hosting such a rich conversation, as well as David, Megan, and Ted for sharing your insights and perspectives into the ways different economic policy tools can support families now. Thank you all so much. And again, to our partner, JPMorgan Chase. As we close out today's event, just a reminder that Code for America Summit is coming up next month, May 16th and 17th here in Washington, D.C. Glennis has added the link to learn more about Summit in the chat, and we hope to see some of you there. Lastly, keep an eye out for some more sessions like this in our Find Your Summit series. With that, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.